Rolling. This is the FedSoc Films Podcast,
where we continue the conversation
sparked on film.
White on set.
You want to know what freedom tastes like? It tastes like this beer.
Take one.
This is, in fact, the classic solution in search of a problem.
Action.
That cannot help but be controversial.
Cut. With expert discussion and analysis. With the greatest legal minds on the topic today. The FedSoc Films Podcast. It's a wrap.
I swear, you hear about it every other week on the news. Some company had its consumers' data stolen from under its digital nose. Companies collect loads of data online, but it would seem it's difficult to control what happens to that data, both in terms of private parties and the government. And if you're online at all, which I assume you are, that's a very real concern. Hello there, and welcome to the FedSoc Films Podcast. I'm Ann Hartley, your data-conscious host. We made a film called Katz on the Internet about privacy in the digital age. I have here with me Jennifer Huddleston, a research fellow at the Cato Institute and an expert on the intersection between emerging technology and the law. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me today.
It's a delight to have you here. All right, so right off the bat, what do you think is the biggest misconception regarding data privacy today?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that when we say data privacy, we mean so many different things. So asking people if they're concerned about their data privacy oftentimes is a pretty obvious question. But what each of us means when we say, I'm concerned about my privacy, may be a little bit different. For some people, what they're really concerned about are questions of government surveillance, of who has access to this data. For other people, they're really concerned about some of the data breaches they may have seen in the news, or concerns about cybersecurity and how safe their data is that are really a different question than data privacy. And then for some people, they're concerned about not understanding what's going on with their data. But I think it's also important to recognize that we're all making a lot of different choices when it comes to data privacy on any single day. And that those choices often reveal a lot more about our privacy preferences than what we may just say in response to the question, do you want more data privacy?
What sort of choices are we talking about here?
So many of us, when we're choosing to go online, are making decisions on a day-to-day basis like, do you want to give this company your email address in exchange for a 10% off coupon? In that situation, you're trying to decide, is your email address a piece of data that's more private to you than that 10% off coupon? For some of us, it may be what browser we choose to use. Do you want that browser that's going to remember the last few sites that you went to? Or do you want something that's going to be more incognito mode, but that every time you open it, you may have to start over from scratch? These are different preferences that we may all have on a day-to-day basis. But there's also a question of what exactly is going on with the government access to this data. And that's kind of a separate question. The question of what, if any, requirements should there be if the government wants to go to one of those companies and ask for, say, internet search history or for cell phone location information or some of these other questions we've seen come up recently.
So why do you think that these separate concerns are so often grouped together?
I think it's just easier for us to say privacy. And like I said, a lot of us mean different things when it comes to privacy. Oftentimes we see this kind of difference in the discourse between what we may be thinking about in terms of Fourth Amendment rights, as well as the kind of question of what does this mean in our day-to-day choices? I think that both of them kind of stem from the fact that we've seen this rapid evolution in technology. And in some cases, we're trying to find the right vocabulary to answer some of these difficult questions.
Gotcha. So I guess the big question in there is what we're doing to deal with privacy, both in terms of government surveillance and like data breaches, cybersecurity, like you were saying. So is there anything that Congress has been doing recently about this?
So we've seen an ongoing debate around data privacy in general of does there need to be some kind of overarching federal data privacy legislation? But that's largely dealing with the what, if anything, should there be for regulation around what companies can and cannot collect or what happens to data afterwards. The concerning thing there is oftentimes privacy can come into friction with other rights, rights like speech rights that are also very important. And as I mentioned, we have a wide range of preferences when it comes to how we might value those different rights or what we might see in terms of the different choices consumers want to make. And oftentimes legislation tends to assume that people automatically want the most restrictive choice. This goes to what we've seen come out of Europe and to some of those annoying cookie pop-ups you may be encountering a lot more when you go online as a response to attempts to comply with regulation. Those type of proposals often also leave open this question of, are we actually any more private? Are we actually any more secure? Or is this just a matter of compliance that's putting a burden on companies, particularly small companies, and potentially preventing innovative solutions from occurring? At the same time, largely through the courts so far, there's been this question of, should there be additional protection in terms of government access to data when it comes to, should they have to have a warrant to get some of this information? This goes to the great video you mentioned that the Federalist Society has done on the Katz on the internet, Katz with a K, not with a C, with regards to how the third party doctrine could come into play with this. We've also seen some states, in light of some of these rulings, notably Utah was the first state to do this, engage in legislation at a state level to clarify kind of what the rights around government access to this information were. Does law enforcement have to have a subpoena when they're trying to access information that may be online? And how might this play out in light of kind of emerging Fourth Amendment jurisprudence?
So how do you think all these different government entities should be approaching the question of data privacy?
We've seen some interesting kind of questions emerge. For the first part, there's this question of, are people as aware today of the third party doctrine and what it means to be giving data over as they were in an era when these doctrines evolved? Are we still seeing a case of where, the average user, when they log on to an app through their phone, knows what information is being shared and thinks of that information as being shared with a third party in the same way they might have thought of back in the day when you had to connect a phone call through an operator, or when, in order to do a transaction at a bank, you had to say something out loud to a teller. So there's this question of, are we as aware of the kind of third party involved, and what might that mean when there are multiple third parties involved even in many of these transactions? What does this look like in the kind of digital age? And what we've seen is, in many cases, the law is able to evolve at common law along with technology and recognize that technology may change certain interpretations. But in other cases, we've had to see the courts or legislation step in and provide clarity around perhaps the need for warrants instead of subpoenas for some of this information. One notable case we saw this happen in recently was the Carpenter case, which involved historical cell phone location information. So the geolocation that your cell phone uses when it's trying to triangulate a call, and clarifying that information was not covered under the third party doctrine, because even though your location has to be shared to route the call, it's not the same kind of environment that this doctrine originally had in mind. It's not kind of the same type of case. And it's not that government or law enforcement can never get that information. It's just that there's a greater standard for it and a more reasonable expectation of privacy that will require things like warrant requirements. We're seeing this continue to evolve over different types of data, different types of online data, and it's likely that we'll continue to see cases in both the state and federal courts grapple with some of these questions and try and determine what is that reasonable expectation on privacy. When are there cases where governments should have to have a warrant? And when are there cases where a subpoena should be sufficient? It's also important to think about the fact that This isn't just clarity for the consumer so that they can make decisions about when their data, what data they may want to share online. This clarity is also really important for entrepreneurs and for online platforms who want to do the right thing by their customer, but who also may be faced with difficult scenarios where they're trying to understand what their rights are and when to comply and how to comply with some of the requests they may be receiving for information on their users.
Gotcha. I'm curious to hear more about the perspective of these third parties and how they deal with this question.
So we've seen this kind of growing question of what should good responses look like. We certainly recognize that there may be cases where this information is needed for law enforcement tasks, but we also want to make sure that the Fourth Amendment is being followed, and that this isn't just a case where this could become a backdoor that could lead to an extreme intrusion of the government onto private citizens' information. We've seen a couple of times where this has really kind of hit some points of friction between the government and various platforms. One of the most notable ones had to do with, trying to force a cell phone to be unlocked and whether or not the government could force that. We've also seen this come up in several cases in policy debates around questions related to encryption, where law enforcement at times has been pushing for a backdoor to encrypted messaging services that could actually open these services up to a great deal of risk, not only for people who are concerned about what these services may be being used for maliciously, but for all users, because if law enforcement has a backdoor to this information, not only do you have surveillance concerns, you have concerns about how a backdoor to encrypted information for law enforcement could be potentially exploited by malevolent or malicious users to get that same information. Because when a backdoor exists for the good guys, it's very hard, if not impossible, to keep it a backdoor for just the good guys. Somebody's going to find that key.
Absolutely. So I guess that brings up the question, is there a way that the United States can approach data privacy to protect both civil liberties and free markets? But, also still giving the government access to this data when they need it for investigations.
One of the key things has been to really focus on the question of what is the actual problem we're trying to solve. Going back to my first answer, so often when we say privacy, we mean so many different things. We want to see data being used in all of the beneficial ways that we've seen, and we want to see continued innovation that can actually even improve privacy and security, because that's certainly something to consider as well. Oftentimes we'll hear particular types of data kind of be singled out for greater attention, things like biometric data. But at the same time, biometric data could also be used to help better secure certain information, to ensure that only the proper person is accessing it. So I think when we're looking at this from a policy approach, first, we have to clarify what is the problem you're trying to solve. Are we looking at government surveillance problems? Are we looking at cybersecurity problems? Are we looking at questions around consumer data more general? And then I think the second question after that is, what is the harm that you are trying to solve? So, for example, in the case of the Katz video, the harm there is really this question of, how do we prevent government surveillance while ensuring that if information is necessary for a law enforcement investigation, that there's a constitutionally appropriate way to obtain that information? And that may come around, clarifying Fourth Amendment doctrines, providing warrant requirements in certain cases that can clarify how this data should be accessed. On the consumer privacy side, I think there's a great role for education, ensuring that consumers are aware of what to do for good best practices for data. Why you might want to use a VPN, why you want to change your passwords regularly. Have you checked your privacy settings in the last year? Some of those reminders so that each of us is interacting with our own privacy preferences and making those decisions. because it may look different for each of us. Some of us may enjoy the targeted ads that create a more of an enjoyable environment where it's more customized to us, but it requires more of our data in order to have that more customized experience that's going to show you ads for your favorite football team's merchandise rather than just whatever random ads were out there based off of any interest. Others may say, I would rather not have that experience. I would rather it not know who I am. I don't care if the ads are for something halfway across the world and that it's not relevant to me at all. I'll just take whatever random ads you want to show and prefer that experience. The good thing is right now, the internet allows us each to kind of choose which experience better fits our preferences, and to even choose that amongst different websites. Maybe there's a website you trust a little more with your data, or that you want that slightly more personalized experience on, and there's another one that you trust less. This provides us with a great deal of consumer choice, and we don't want a world where it presumes that any use of data is automatically malicious or should automatically be suspicious, because we're seeing that data can transform the world not only online, but offline as well. And we have to think about that side of things as well. Data privacy, we typically think about as what's going on social media or what happened with this data breach. But many of these proposals that we've seen would apply much more broadly than that. They would apply to everything from your local grocery store loyalty program to much deeper data that can go to very industry specific concerns and be used to help resolve those.
I see. So the way you're envisioning this is data privacy online, as far as consumers are concerned, it's better off as a personal choice that you can tailor to what you prefer to see, rather than having just one top-down cookie-cutter option.
In many cases, yes. Now, one of the growing concerns is that we are having this emerging state patchwork of laws that could be increasingly problematic because they're likely to have extraterritorial effects, not only on companies, but on consumers as well. We've already seen this with Europe's GDPR, their data privacy regulation, when in many cases, companies found it easier just to apply what they'd already done for compliance globally. Now, as we start to see more states like California put forth highly regulatory data privacy regimes, we're likely to see that this spill over to states that are still preserving consumer choice and are still trying to preserve that flexibility. I do think one underappreciated policy tool in this conversation is the role of consumer education. What is it possible so that consumers can understand the choices they're making better and make sure that they're making the choices that actually align with their personal preferences? I also think it's important to remember in this conversation that there are kind of underlying laws that can come into play. When we're talking about true deception, there are already laws that can come into play in those cases. There are already potential consumer protection there. It's also important to recognize that there's already data breach laws. So when you're worried about, the kind of Target hack that happened a few years ago or things like that, there's already a state-by-state data breach patchwork that, while, again, we have that state-by-state patchwork approach that can be concerning, consumers are going to be notified and aware so that they can hopefully make decisions and monitor things as appropriate.
Absolutely. Are there any resources that you would recommend to our listeners who are interested in learning more?
I think it depends on what you're interested in learning more about. There are a lot of different resources out there for helping to protect your own privacy if you're trying to figure out that maybe you want a more privacy-centric web opportunity, including the fact that there are privacy checkups on most of the major apps where you can go in and it will kind of walk you through, these are your current privacy settings. We're also seeing an increasing number of what are called just-in-time notifications that when you download a new app, it will prompt you to ask, do you want to share your location with this app? Things like that. When it comes to the Fourth Amendment conversation that's going on, I do highly recommend the video you guys at Federalist Society did on Katz. I think it does a great job of walking through kind of how this doctrine emerged, what some of the questions are, how it's currently applying to the internet. And then there are a range of scholars, including myself, that have written a great deal about kind of analyzing some of these trade-offs that may occur when we're considering data privacy laws at both a state and federal level.
So what's a good place to find your work that you've been writing on?
Great. So my work is available on the Cato website. And then I also often post about these topics to X, formerly Twitter, under @JRHuddles.
All right. We'll have to check it out. Well, thank you again, Jennifer. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you, folks, for listening in. You can find the link to our film, Katz on the Internet, in the description on our YouTube channel or at fedsoc.org. That's FEDSOC.org. As always, the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker. That's a wrap.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.